So moving on with Gebser then, in volume 2 we move on to chapter 4, which is called the New Concepts. And the new concepts are simply the fourth dimension and temporix. And temporix is simply his word for concern with time anxiety and the concern with time, which he sees as the leading theme of the age that we're in now, the age of the temporal, the integration of time and the creation of the integral consciousness structure, which is aperspectival. As the chapter opens up, he talks about inceptions of the new consciousness, where he makes an interesting point. He says that as these mutations have taken place throughout history, so too at the same time, human physiology actually undergoes mutations or subtle changes, sometimes more dramatic, sometimes not. And he looks back at, for example, as an example of this, he looks at the shift in Egyptian art, the way in which the cranium is visible, the top part of the forehead is visible, or not visible actually, in Egyptian art, and how it comes and surfaces into visibility by the time you get to the Greek sculpture of the 4th century BC, at the time when the mental consciousness structure is configuring and concretizing and solidifying. It's at that point that we see in the artworks of Praxiteles and Lysippus the forehead sort of rising into view and the scalp, as it were, receding. And he says if you look by contrast back at the mythical, magical world of the Egyptian, all the statues of Pharaoh that are always covered by headgear. The forehead it's always gone, it's always covered by headgear, such as in the famous statue of Nefertiti, or in any of the statues of the Egyptians whatsoever, that the forehead is always covered. So he sees the surfacing of the forehead as itself a kind of physiological, subtle, unconscious physiological change that is manifest when a new consciousness structure, in this case the mental, comes into being. He says you can see something similar too when the mental consciousness is rediscovered in Northern Europe. If you look at the way that the Madonna is represented with the Christ child in Byzantine art, the Christ child is normally on the left side of the Madonna in Byzantine art. And you can see this if you do a quick Google search on Byzantine images, and they all come up and you scan them very quickly. You can see that indeed the normal thing was to have the Christ child on the left. Occasionally you see the child on the right, but more often you'll see it on the left. The left is the heart side, the less conscious side. Now, as you fast forward through the centuries and you get down to, let's say, the images of Raphael, do a Google search on Raphael's Madonnas, pull them up, and what do you see? The Christ child indeed has shifted to the right side, with a few exceptions, but more often than not, the infant on Mary's lap is on the right side. And Gebser says this is one of the subtle physiological manifestations of the rediscovery of the mental consciousness structure and the shift from left to right that takes place in tandem with this. And he also says that something similar must also be happening physiologically with the inception of the integral consciousness structure, but he's not clear about what it is. He says it might have something to do with the emphasis on cognitive science and the emphasis on cognition, but he's rather vague about that aspect. But this is an interesting point that he begins the chapter with. And then he moves into the main discussion of this chapter, which is on the 4th dimension. And he talks about how the 4th dimension then basically is something that begins to come into being with non-Euclidean geometry, which is a discovery of the 19th century. It begins right about 1800 with Gauss in 1799 or 1800, who is the first one to discover it. And then we have Gauss, and we have Riemann, and we have Bolyai, and we have Lobachevsky, all throughout the course of the 19th century, and completely unbeknownst to each other's works, discovering the n-dimensional world of Euclidean geometry. So it's a brand new thing that's happening, and it happens first in mathematics. It precedes the development of aperspectivity in painting by a number of decades, where it first appears in painting, obviously, with Manet and Cezanne and so forth. But this discovery of non-Euclidean space is, of course, a discovery of curved space, since most of non-Euclidean geometry is theorized about on curved topological manifolds and surfaces, toruses, parabolas, saddle shapes, and so forth. And Gauss was one of the first to realize that prior to non-Euclidean geometry, it had been thought that the three angles, the sum total of the three angles of a triangle, any triangle, should always add up to 180 degrees. This was a universal postulate of Euclidean geometry until Gauss put a triangle on a curved surface, which of course changes its morphology, and then when you add up those angles, they no longer add up to 180 degrees. And so Gauss was the first to figure this out. Shortly after him, then we have Cezanne painting on curved surfaces. He's basically putting objects into curved space. Gebser says Cezanne is one of the first painters to actually paint on curved space, and that begins to bring in the distortions of objects, and the disintegration of the perspectival mental consciousness structure begins to take place at that point. Then with Einstein, who begins to theorize, he builds the physics version of all of this and theorizes it, we begin to get this notion that we are essentially encased in curved space. Every planet warps and bends the space that it's embedded in, and that creates gravity. Gravity is a function no longer in Einstein of force moving the mass that falls off inversely proportional to the square of the distance between the objects, but now it's actually simply curved space, and light travels along geodesic lines through this curved space, and it follows the geodesics, which are always curved. And then, so as anyone knows who's read Stephen Hawking or watched any of his videos, the ultimate conception that we have arrived at in our physical cosmological world picture is that the cosmos is a giant sphere that has expanded from an initial singularity and has been slowly expanding, all the galaxies flying away from each other like a gigantic inflating balloon. Notice then that we are arriving at the end of our civilization at the retrieval of a cosmic sphere, seeing the entire universe encased in a cosmic sphere.